Woof woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and yes, I have finally had a haircut. But more importantly than that, we've got our first trailer for the Amazon Prime animated version of Robert Kirkman's Invincible. And this is a series that I have absolutely loved for a number of years. It was one of those that I was buying when it was originally coming out. I even read single issues around the 70s or so at one point. Anybody who has read this 144 issue epic knows just how great this series already is. And with that trailer, all the excitement that I had whilst I was reading this came back to me, and if there's one thing that I remember about Invincible more than anything else, it's those absolutely insane fights. Because Robert Kirkman had the freedom to do whatever he wanted and be as graphic and as violent as he needed to be, or completely change his characters to facilitate the story. So I wanted to make a list of my top 10 favourite fights in Invincible, and I took down all the Ultimate Collections, had a flick through, reminisced over some of the scenes that I really liked, and I realised one thing: it wouldn't be possible to just do 10, so here is my top 15 favourite fights in Invincible. Now before we jump into the first pick, it's 2020 and I still have to say this, but this is my personal opinion. Your favourite fight might not have meant as much as it did to me. For me, I really like the fights that have a combination of great art, it felt important to the story, but it also had some kind of drive going forward. And as well, if you haven't read this series already, please do, but just be warned that there are going to be major spoilers throughout this video. So my number 15 pick is going to be Invincible vs Powerplex in issue 59. On the surface, it may not seem like this is an important one at all, but it just really sat heavy with me after I'd finished reading it. Now around issue 50 to issue 80 is when the majority of the great moments in this book happened. Now there's stuff that's happening before that and after that that's also great, but these were really the peak issues for me. And I think this was when Ryan Ottley really hit his stride, because the colorist changed around issue 50 and I can't remember who it changed to, but at that point the art just popped so much more. So you've got this character Powerplex who's just being introduced, you get to look at a bit of his backstory, you know, he's got all this family aspect going on, but more than anything I like this fight because of the way that electricity was used and illustrated. It's also got Invincible in the black and blue costume, which I think I probably preferred over the yellow and blue, but even though this isn't anywhere near as close to like the biggest fight that's happened in the series, I just felt it really packed an emotional punch that a lot of the others didn't really ever seem to try and do. It made you feel for a character that wasn't one of the main ones, you know, you got to see Mark kind of justify what exactly he'd done as a result of Powerplex accidentally killing his family that he was holding hostage just so he could get Invincible to face him. That shit really hit deep, and I just love the way it handled that kind of story. Number 14 is going to be Invincible and then Alan vs Anissa the Viltrumite from issue 45. At this stage in the book, we'd heard about the Viltrumites and we knew how deadly they were. We'd seen a few fights against them, but more often than not, except for if it was Omni-Man, it normally tended to happen off-world. This was one of the first times that a Viltrumite had visited Mark on Earth, and at first it kind of throws you for a bit of a loop because you see Anissa try and help Mark, especially with this sinking ship. Anissa talks quite a good game, and it's the first time that we're properly introduced to her, and she does have quite a dominating presence. I liked her design and a lot of the rhetoric, and that at first they tried to soften her up so that she looked like she wasn't going to be like the other Viltrumites that we've seen before. However, all that changes, and I like the fact that Mark still isn't really at a stage where he can properly fight one of these Viltrumites on his own. He still goes for it, which is something that I've really liked about the character throughout the entire series, but then we also get this second aftermath in space where we see Alan the alien taking her on as well. There's just a lot that I really like about this. I like the build up before it, I like the fight as it's happening, but I also like the fact that there's a second fight that happens within this fight. And as well, up until this point, this was one of my favourite fights within the series, because I really like the fights that are based on Earth, and over the course of this video there is probably going to be ones that crop up on other planets too, but I think it just makes the story much more personal when it is Mark's homeworld that's coming under attack. If anything, it's just a shame that it came so early on in the story because of how great the fights were later on. Number 13, I've got Dinosaurus vs Thrack. Now these are the two possibly most morally ambiguous characters within the story, and when they come together and fight, it really is a great moment, even though it doesn't last too long. What I liked about Invincible as a series, and what this fight really illustrated, was the fact that they understood exactly what the character was going up against and if they'd be able to survive. What I mean by this is that Dinosaurus doesn't really ever stand a chance against a Viltrumite. You see this when he tries to bite into Thrack's head and just all of his teeth shatter. But at this stage there's so much emotion going on. We've got Mark that's completely vulnerable, he's been infected by this virus, and you've got two characters kind of fighting off in the background with each other about something that the majority of the cast don't even understand yet. You felt like you were in a fight for truth, and especially when you look at the way Dinosaurus is portrayed throughout the series, I think this was a key pivotal moment for him. As well, Thrack was a great antagonist throughout this entire book, and I liked the role that he played, especially when Mark was ill. So this for me was one of those fights where I didn't even really know who exactly I wanted to win, because was it the case that I wanted Dinosaurus to do something to protect Mark, or did I want Thrack to end up becoming a better villain? It really was one of those that toyed with my expectations and emotions for both these characters, and I just really really enjoyed it and I wish it could have lasted a bit longer. Number 12, we've got Invincible and his dad Omni-Man fighting two Viltrumites on an alien planet. This all happened in issue 29, and at this point we'd gone through quite an emotional journey when it came to Mark and his dad Nolan. But this stage you got that sense that there was still so much unease, you know, Mark wanted his dad because he felt betrayed by him, but at the same time you couldn't really ever trust him because of what he'd done in the earlier issues. However, when the Viltrumites came and attacked and tried to capture his dad and arrest him as a prisoner, this is when everything really hit the fan. And it was really our first taste at one of those pure brutal fights in Invincible, whereas this introduced that technique that they perfected a lot later, where there'd be characters fighting in the foreground and you'd get like squares of the fight happening in the background as well. It really gave you this sense that this was an exhausting battle for the pair of them, and I like the way that this sort of positioned Mark to really trust his dad once again. Like I said, if the fight serves some kind of emotional purpose, that will probably do more for me than if it's just a big intergalactic space battle. And although it was early on in the story and people probably forget that this one happened, for me this was one of those standout moments when it comes to this book. Number 11, we've got Thrack vs Battle Beast, and this went on between issues 115 all the way up to 120. Now I know a lot of people really enjoyed this fight, but for me I feel like it lacked in importance because of the fact that it was one of those things that you kept cutting away to. I thought this was interesting as a concept, especially because Invincible up till this point has been so focused on the fights that it's like, hey, here's a massive one that's spanning 5 issues and we're not even really going to focus on it because it's just going on in the background. It did give you that sense of time because obviously the story was going on as this happened, but for me I just felt like it was lacking that major impact that it could have had because of the fact that it was more wrapped up in the other stories that were going on at that point. However, Battle Beast is a unique character. I really loved his design, and he was one of those characters that just wanted the ultimate battle, and he finally got that wish even if it brought him to his end. This is one of those brutal fights. It does seem to just go on forever, and you do genuinely wonder at parts who exactly can win this, or is it going to be some kind of like Superman Doomsday situation and they both just die, you know, trying to kill each other. It really solidified Thrack as well because he ends up becoming the victor, and you also get Battle Beast thanking him at the end for it, which I just felt was hilarious after 5 issues of fighting. But Thrack had gone through this process where he'd kind of been humiliated and defeated a little bit, so this really solidified him as a threat that he really is. It was a nice little reprieve, especially considering that the majority of my list probably involved characters like Invincible himself or his dad, whereas this was 2 characters that weren't the sole focus, but they really got to duke it out until the death, and it was great. Coming in at number 10 from issue 102, we've got Nolan vs Thrack. Yeah, Thrack's appearing in a lot of these because he was that much of a threat, and this was the main fight that really came before the one that we just talked about against Battle Beast. And like I said, Nolan, Omni-Man, who's pretty much the equivalent to Superman in their world, had gone through this redemption arc, and then it really came to a head at this point when he fought Thrack and he kind of overtook him. He got to then lead the Viltrumite army, so even though it wasn't one of the most spectacular battles that we've seen, and a lot of people are probably thinking that the fight against Battle Beast was more important and more entertaining, for me it was mainly about the way that this changed the status quo. I did not see this happening, especially when those Viltrumite backups came. I thought this was going to be curtains closed for Nolan, but it wasn't, and it really changed the dynamic of it, and it gave you this insight into the heritage of these characters, which is one of the only reasons that Nolan was allowed to survive. It was such an interesting development, and it was weird that the climax of the fight actually overshadowed the fight itself. Up until then it was a cool fight, but it wasn't really that important. I just really loved the way that this did a complete left turn and made you question where exactly this story was going to go after this. We've broken into the single digits, and coming in at number 9 we've got Invincible vs Conquest. Round 2. Yeah, we're talking issue 72 here. You know I'm not going to put round 1 this early on in the list. But as rematches go, this one's definitely up there, and I kind of like that it did feel like you're in a boxing scenario that, you know, you've seen them fight the first time, you've seen exactly what these two can do when they come together. And now they've learned from those mistakes, they've healed a little bit, and it's like, come on, round 13, here we go, let's just get it on. And it really was that was the case. This came just before the Viltrumite War as well, which was this event that'd been built up to forever. But what I really liked about this fight is that Mark just focused on it, whereas you as the reader were probably asking a lot of questions about how is Mark going to react when he finds that, you know, Cecil lied about the fact that Conquest wasn't dead. It also showed the way that Mark had developed. He'd learned from a lot of his mistakes that he'd made in the previous fight, but I also liked that Conquest was just ready to run through anyone. Oliver was going to get it, his dad was going to get it, but Mark just took it on himself to close this fight off as quickly as he could as a result of what he'd learned from that first fight. I think that as a story arc and and especially the fact that by the end it looks like Mark's ripped in half as a result of just trying to stop Conquest once and for all, really brought this fight together and just made it incredibly enjoyable. And I like the way that the art kind of changed a little bit as a result of them being in space compared to their first match where it was that they were entirely on Earth, except for maybe a few panels. Coming in at number 8, we've got Invincible vs Angstrom Levy from issue 33. Now yeah, this one was brutal. I know that I talked about the Anissa fight as one of those most brutal ones early on, but this one definitely took the cake for that. There was so much raw anger with this. You saw Mark really let loose. You saw some of that Viltrumite anger that his dad had talked about really coming through in a lot of his actions here. The thing that was really cool about this fight in particular was that you've got Mark, who's this guy that could easily walk through Angstrom Levy, but then Angstrom Levy's got technology and science to his advantage. So you do get all this cool switching between portals and stuff like that, and it ends up that Mark's in this completely desolate area and he doesn't really know how to survive there. But you just know as soon as Mark finds his feet that he's going to be able to punch the shit out of this guy, and he completely does. Like, it's as brutal as you can imagine. Like, imagine Superman just fighting someone as puny and weedy as me. It's one of those where you want this fight to keep carrying on, but at the same time you don't, because you know that Angstrom's smart enough to be able to get rid of Mark if he gets a chance to. So it really was a test of brains versus brawn. And like I said, when you look at the development and the maturity of Mark as a character, I think this was one of those seminal moments, and it's one that really rang true to me, and it sticks in my head quite a lot when I think back about this series. Number 7, we've got Dinosaurus vs Invincible, and this was the final fight that they had between issues 98 and issue 100. I was reading the book in single issues at this point, and I remember that as we were getting closer to issue 100, Kirkman kept teasing that something massive was going to happen. Now, like I said, from his introduction, Dinosaurus has been one of those characters that you really didn't know whether you could trust or not. Every time Mark decided to not trust him, you felt a bit uneasy, but at the same time, every time Mark decided to trust him and work with him, you felt even worse. But it all came to a head with issue 100, and I like the fact that they really committed to what they did. It was the final time that we were going to see Dinosaurus, and it felt like that. You know, we got this fight to kind of solidify exactly who this character was. They had a great debate towards the end, and you know, Mark realised that he had nothing left to do other than kill Dinosaurus. It was Mark coming to terms with the fact that, you know, maybe killing every villain isn't so bad because of the actions that Dinosaurus took before that. However, I wasn't a massive fan of the fake out death that they had for Mark between issues. You know, it's clear that when you're reading it in a collected edition now, that was solely just to get people to buy the very next issue, but it immediately kind of raised any tension with the fact that they're like, oh yeah, that was faked. But still, Invincible did have quite a good running theme that they celebrated these milestone issues. So at issue 50, you had Invincible finally separated from Cecil. At issue 75, you had the Viltrumite War, and I like that they kind of quietened it down a bit for issue 100 and just had this personal moment between Mark and Dinosaurus. Number 6, we've got the Thrack War. That's what I'm going to call this. It ran between issues 136 and issue 140, and this for me was the final arc of the story, because the entire driving force of the book had been Mark making the decision between if he's really from Earth or if he's really a Viltrumite. And after the Viltrumite War had decimated most of the population, Thrack had been producing like crazy. So he's got an army of millions of his own children, and you just see them go all out at war. This was Ryan Ottley really coming into his final stride. This was him getting his swan song. All the pages on this were absolutely perfect. There was so much detail in them. You could look for hours and still not be able to see all the figures that were actually drawn there. And there were some massive repercussions as a result of this. So Omni-Man ended up seeing his final fight. You saw Atom Eve really coming to terms with the fact that, you know, Mark had gone through this experience with a Viltrumite woman, and you got to see Mark fight in the center of the sun, which was just insane. Yeah, he did come across as a little bit gimmicky and a little bit stupid, but for me, I think this might have even been top of the list had this happened mainly on Earth. But still, it was a great war, it was beautifully drawn, and I think this was one of the perfect finales that this series could have had. Now we're breaking into my top 5, but before we do so, I want you to comment below what your favourite fight is in Invincible and why it's probably going to be the exact same as my number 1. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't done so already, become a mad dog with us and click that subscribe button down below. Number 5, Invincible vs Cecil from issue 50. Again, we knew that issue 50 was going to be important, and we knew that the status quo was going to change. Up until this point, we knew that we couldn't really trust Cecil. He'd done a few things behind Mark's back that we didn't really agree with, but this was when everything came to a head, and when Mark realised that he had been working behind his back with that weird zombie robot army. As well, you really got to see the vindictive power that Cecil actually has, because again, similar to other characters that we've talked about in this list like Angstrom Levy, you knew it was going to be the case that if Invincible actually got to punch Cecil in the face, he'd probably completely take his head off. But we saw that Cecil had that Batman-like mind that he's always prepared for someone to just betray him, so he's always got a contingency in place. I really love this, and I love the way they panned out. Even if it wasn't a massive bloodbath like you'd hope it'd be, it was still quite a defining moment within the story, and I think think it really changed the tone for the rest of the book. Coming in at number 4, we've got the Invincible War from issue 60. This was another thing that had been built up throughout the previous issues. So obviously you'd seen Angstrom Levy going throughout the different dimensions and picking up all the alternative Invincibles, and you just knew that eventually that was going to come to a head, because with Robert Kirkman, that's always been his thing. He's great at giving you the build up and the payoff, and that payoff came in issue 60, and you just saw all these Invincibles completely take over Earth. Even London got featured at one point. That's how you know that they were really trying to take over everywhere. But this was great because it incorporated all of the Image universe. So you saw Savage Dragon, there's even like Spawn on one of the covers at one point. What I liked about this is that it addressed the fact as well that if there's an earth-shattering event going on, they will pull in as many people as they can. It's not going to be that type of situation like in the MCU where it's like, yeah, we already know that the Hulk exists, but he's not going to help Captain America out just because of reasons. Everybody was trying their absolute hardest to fight off all these Invincible waves, and you actually got to see a lot of great art throughout it. As well, the reason why I think this ranks so high for me is because of the aftermath. Now, I'm not just talking about what you probably already know is going to be number 1, but you got to see the repercussions of a world that's been overtaken by these superheroes. You got to see all the destruction that's left in the wake, all the death and all the chaos that's ensued because of that. And Invincible is great for all these massive fights that take place across the entire planet, across the entire universe, but sometimes it's just nice to be reminded that, you know, there are people living in these buildings, there are people that are going to be affected by all these superheroes running around and punching each other in the face. Now, getting the bronze medal is going to be the Viltrumite War from issues 75 to 76. Again, this was something else that was built up and we were ready for it, and man did it pay off. This was the culmination of all the 75 issues that had come beforehand. So you saw Mark and his dad finally fighting together again, you saw Oliver be a part of that as well, you had all these characters that had featured throughout the story, and everything just really worked. It felt like it was just going from stride to stride, like they knew exactly what they were doing in the beginning and they knew how to just step it up at each opportunity that they got, culminating with the fact that Viltrumite is completely decimated, and as a result, the Viltrumites that were remaining have this kind of uneasy alliance with the heroes of Earth to like exist amongst them, but at the same time you just know eventually that's going to explode in the face. So it was great because it felt like it was closing off the arc that had come before it, but it was setting up this really interesting arc coming after it. I loved that, and for me this is one of those arcs that I go back and I just read randomly because obviously it's 144 issues long. I don't always have time to read the entire thing beginning to end, but the Viltrumite War for me is something that I always find myself coming back to and I enjoy every single time that I do. Now, getting the runner-up spot at number 2 is going to be Invincible vs Omni-Man from issue 12. Yes, I know that the art wasn't perfect on this. Ryan Ottley had only just joined and it felt like he didn't really know how extreme he could go at this point, but for me, this fight just hurt. It was hard to read, and that's when you know that it's doing something really well, because of the fact that you've got Mark not wanting to fight his dad, but his dad's got this job that he has to fulfill and he has no other choice other than to fight his son. This was one of those where I found myself needing to pause after I'd finished this issue, because you see Mark just lying in this broken mess, begging for his dad to come back, but you know that his dad probably isn't going to, and his dad is now the villain of the story. The reason why this is placing so high is because before this moment, this series wasn't really doing too much different for me to make me say that I was really loving it. As soon as that twist happened with Omni-Man, you knew something was going to happen with Mark. You knew they'd have to come face to face and own up to it at some point, but when it did, you kind of didn't want it to happen because of those results that occurred. Like, I am not ready for when people watch the animated show and they don't know that that thing's going to happen, and then it does. I don't know how they're going to handle that in the animated show, and honestly, it's probably the thing that I'm most looking forward to in it. But it does speak volumes for this fight that something that happened so early on in a 144 issue run made it into the second place on this list, and it would have made number 1 if it wasn't for the pick that's already there, which of course is Invincible vs Conquest round 1. This absolutely epic onslaught of a fight ran for 4 issues. It was issue 61, 62, 63 and 64. That's how mega this fight was. Honestly, I know that everybody's got their own opinion, but if somebody told me that there was a fight that they enjoyed more than Invincible vs Conquest, I wouldn't know what to do with that. I wouldn't know how to speak to that person, because for me, this was everything that was great about Invincible. It was perfect art, the colouring was phenomenal, there was so much emotion, there was so much energy in the fighting, and you genuinely got the sense that the characters were getting more and more tired as it went on. This reminded me a lot of the end fight in Metal Gear Solid 4. The people fighting towards the end are just knackered, that they're fighting to the death because they know that death's going to come for them if they don't do it first. And as well, you've got Oliver getting caught up in the mix. Adam Eve gets killed at one point in this. That cover of issue 63 is ingrained in my head, where you can see Mark holding his broken arm, the bones spewing everywhere, but you know he's still gonna fight because he absolutely has to. As well, the funniest thing is that the Invincible War was 1 issue long, and the Invincible War Aftermath, which was the Conquest fight, was 4 issues long. It was 4 times as long as the event that caused this thing to happen. And it illustrates exactly what is great about Invincible, that at the moment where you think everything's calm, that everything's gonna go back to normal, no, this new character arrives and he's just like, I'm gonna fuck up all your shit and you aren't gonna do anything about it unless you wanna die. Conquest was an amazing foe, and I kinda wish they would have kept him around a little bit longer, but at the same time I like the fact that because they only had 2 fights together, it kind of pointed to the fact that these are the 2 main fights in Invincible that really mattered to me. If they would have had about 7 or so fights, it probably would have diluted the impact that that first one did have. And when we're talking about impact, nothing impacted me more in this series than the fight with Conquest. We are talking about a fight that ends because Mark has both arms broken to the point where he's got nothing left that he can do besides headbutt Conquest in the face until the guy is dead. And that's exactly what he does, and that to me is why this is one of the most unique, entertaining, and just brutal comics that has ever existed. And it's why I'm so excited for this animated show to come out. And normally I don't really watch too many animated adaptations of comics because there isn't really much translation, but I am so excited to see how they do any of these fights throughout the series. And hopefully you're excited for it too. If you haven't read Invincible, this probably isn't the best video that you could have watched about it, but if you have, let me know in the comment section below what your favourite fight was and we can discuss it a bit further there. And again, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you didn't like this video, why did you get this far? This video took me quite a while to do because I had to flick through all of these books just to make sure that I didn't leave a fight out. So if you haven't already become part of the Dog Pound, click that subscribe button below and click that bell notification so that you never miss a video. If you do want to support the channel, maybe you want to upgrade some of your Invincible books to the Ultimate Collections, I do have Amazon affiliate links down below. It doesn't increase the price, I can't see any of your details, it just means that eventually I'll be able to afford a better camera. But check out some of my links, I'm always posting comic content up on there. But until the next video, just make sure that you stay safe, keep reading, and keep barking all you mad dogs.